semesters, 4 terms. So just like, no, come in 4 times a day for 1 term, and then be done with science for the rest of the year.
All right, so the last things we need to talk about are hormones and how some other effects that they have on other types of organisms. Well, we've been talking mostly about human body and human hormones, but hormones are present in lots of different species, lots of different kingdoms even, and hormones are responsible in lots of cases for the timing of reproduction and development in various types of organisms. For example, tadpoles metamorph into frogs, and that's based on hormones that control that. Butterflies metamorphizing from caterpillars, another example, or grasshoppers molting. All of those organisms, that process is controlled by hormones. And so you see, obviously, tadpole to frog. Here you have, what type of metamorphosis is this?
A butterfly.
It is a butterfly, called complete. When you go from caterpillar stage to an adult stage, it looks quite different. Or you just have the molting behavior of other types of insects, when basically they just leave their exoskeleton behind and then can grow larger until the next exoskeleton forms. All right, let's talk about some disorders.
Oh, fun.
Endocrine disorders are fairly common, some of them. Some are fairly rare. Depends on which ones. So, obviously, diabetes is one of the most common. Diabetes, mellitus is the scientific name for it, is what you would think of probably when someone has diabetes, their body generally not producing insulin. Okay? And so we know insulin's produced where? In the pancreas. In special cells in the pancreas, the islets of Langerhans, are these special areas within the pancreas that are responsible for insulin production. And sometimes they stop working. Sometimes the body's own immune system destroys these cells, and so they no longer function. Like a lot of people have normal pancreas throughout childhood, and then at some point, for some reason, their own immune system attacks their pancreas and destroys those cells, and then they have diabetes after that. Okay? And so their body doesn't produce insulin, okay, and it leads to elevated blood sugar levels. We know that a person that does have diabetes can monitor their own. So the homeostatic means of their own endocrine system monitoring and adjusting their blood sugar breaks down and doesn't work properly. So instead, they have to take their own manual precautions to monitor and regulate their blood sugar. So as you probably know, if you know people that are diabetic, they have to test their blood sugar regularly, pricking their finger, using a glucose test strip, and that tells them the level of glucose in their blood. If they find that the level of glucose in their blood is getting too high, they can give themselves insulin, okay? Insulin that's produced synthetically. A while back, they used to get insulin from pigs. It used to be pig insulin that people with diabetes would have to give themselves. Now they have synthetic insulin that is manufactured through genetically modified bacteria. And so they have to inject themselves with insulin. Some people might have an insulin pump, which they may wear around their waist. It has a little tube connected to a little infusion site that puts insulin into their body that way. There are even insulin inhalers that sometimes people use. There's the insulin pod that a person might wear up on sort of their shoulder that gives them insulin. There's lots of ways a person can get insulin. It depends on their own situation, how much they need, and various things. And so that's how diabetes is treated. There's no cure. There's no way of replacing those damaged cells yet. It's an area of research that scientists are always working on, but there's no real cure for diabetes as of now. There's thyroid disorders are also common endocrine disorders, and they're sort of split into categories of hypothyroidism or hyperthyroidism. Okay, those prefixes, hypo means what? Yeah, it means under, basically. Hyper means over. So hypothyroidism is having an underactive thyroid gland for some reason. We know our thyroid gland helps regulate our metabolism. Now, in almost every one of these hormones, their effects, although we might say our thyroid gland regulates our metabolism, most of these hormones have many functions on many different types of body tissue. We cannot possibly go into all the details of that, but they have wide-reaching impacts on lots of different cells, so it's not so simple as we make it sound, but for our purposes, that's okay. So our thyroid gland helps regulate our metabolism, and so a couple things that when a person, one of the things that the thyroid gland itself requires iodine, okay, one of the minerals. And so if it doesn't have that iodine, because iodine is a molecule that is present in thyroxine, the hormone that's produced by the thyroid gland. If a person doesn't have enough iodine, the thyroid gland cannot produce thyroxine, and that leads to hypothyroidism. Oftentimes what happens if a person has this is their thyroid gland starts to swell up. It's called goiter. And what's sort of sometimes confusing, it also could happen if a person has hyperthyroidism. So this swollen up neck is one of the symptoms of having these thyroid conditions. So the thyroid gland may be enlarged. It's treated by people, consuming more iodine. This is often a problem in people that live in areas where the soil is deficient in iodine. Because, for example, the oceans have lots of iodine in them, so usually coastal areas, iodine deficiency is not a problem. But in more inland areas, sometimes the soil is poor in iodine, and therefore foods grown, plants grown in that soil, is deficient in iodine. Animals that eat those plants are deficient, and people that use those as foods may not be getting enough iodine in their diet. Now, we have no problem getting iodine because it's artificially put into what?
Salt.
Into our salt. So when you see a canister of salt, it'll say iodized salt. That means they've added iodine to be sure that people are getting enough for proper functioning of the thyroid gland. But a lot of parts of the world, they don't have iodized salt. Sometimes surgery can be used to reduce the goiter. It can lead to problems like stroke and other things. When a woman has hypothyroidism that is untreated, you can take thyroxine artificially. You can take thyroxine. If you're deficient, if you have hypothyroidism, your thyroid gland's not working properly, you can just take thyroxine medication to help regulate the levels. If a woman has hypothyroidism but doesn't treat it properly and gets pregnant, then her child can have hypothyroidism as well. And there's a whole host of negative physiological and mental problems that result from not having a well-functioning thyroid gland early in development as a fetus and as a newborn. Leads to, it's called cretinism, is the name of the disease, and it can lead to poor physical development, poor mental development. It can lead to mental deficiencies, all sorts of negative consequences. If it's detected early enough, it can be treated with artificial thyroxine, but if not, the effects are basically permanent. And cretinism has studied for a long time. Now I was reading something that was saying in ancient Rome, there would be whole villages of people where everybody had cretinism because the soils in that area were just deficient in iodine, and therefore all the mothers had it, all the children had it. It was just present in that area. As adults, another hypothyroidism condition is called myxedema. It's caused by undersecretion of thyroxine in adults. Leads to distinctive puffy eyes, person being tired or mentally dull. And again, thyroid medication can be used to help treat this. The opposite conditions are hyperthyroidism, where you have an overactive thyroid gland, too much thyroxine being produced, and a person can have a very high metabolic rate, can have difficulty keeping weight on, be too thin. They can have an increased heart rate, nervousness, bulging eyes are one of the sort of telltale symptoms of hyperthyroidism. Sometimes a person can have surgery. Sometimes they even can give a person radioactive iodine that actually can destroy a part of their thyroid gland so that they produce less of these thyroid compounds. These just shows, obviously, we have the tools of people with diabetes, a blood glucose monitor, and so forth. So here, this is a person with cretinism. This is an adult that has stunted growth and all sorts of other health problems because of that lack of thyroxine in development. And this is mixed edema. This is a person with underactive thyroid gland, and it leads to distinct buildup of and swelling of patches under the eyes, between the shoulders, on the back. And this is a person with pretty large goiter.
That has to be
That's
like
thyroid gland, and there's worse examples of this I've seen.
Wait, if you were to take a needle and just
No,
put it
it's
in
not
the-
like a bubble of fluid that's gonna, you can just drain it off. It's your swollen thyroid gland. It's tissue. It's your thyroid
It can
tissue
get
that's
that
swollen.
big?
Yeah, it can get much bigger than that
Can you look it up?
at some point. All right, a couple other
That looks like a frog throat.
pituitary disorders. So there's a whole host of, as you guys know, pituitary hormones, and sometimes tumors of the pituitary gland lead to the over or under production of various pituitary hormones. The ones we'll just talk about are growth hormone disorders. So sometimes a person's pituitary gland is underactive and does not produce enough growth hormone. And growth hormone has several abbreviations. GH sometimes, human growth hormone, HGH, growth stimulating hormone. They're all really referring to the same thing, this growth hormone. And so if there's too little growth hormone, the bones don't receive the proper signals to elongate and grow during development, and it leads to dwarfism, abnormally short person as they finish growing. There are HGH supplements that can be given to a child if it turns out they have a problem with their pituitary gland producing growth hormone. Nate?
Is there any difference between the symptoms of dwarfism and grading?
Yeah, they have different causes.
What about symptoms?
Yeah, the symptoms are different because the symptoms. So dwarfism can be a lack of stature, of height, but basically all other body systems functioning properly. It's just that you do not grow to a normal height. Whereas cretinism leads to all sorts of physical problems as well as developmental problems and mental problems. The opposite of dwarfism is an excess production of growth hormone. Often this is caused by a tumor of the pituitary gland, which leads to too much human growth hormone being produced. In childhood, that leads to gigantism, which is growing to an abnormally tall height. People that grow to 7.5 or almost 8 feet tall. Those are people that have some sort of growth hormone excess. The joints can be deformed, can lead to stress on all the other body systems because it's very difficult to maintain blood flow and other body functions to all of that tissue. Sometimes surgery can be used to remove a tumor of the pituitary gland to help reduce that. When the excess human growth hormone happens in adulthood, after growth plates have sort of closed up, that leads to something called acromegaly, which leads to swelling of certain joints in the body where those bones are sort of grown past the time when they should have. And I'll show you a picture on the next slide. There are also some adrenal disorders of the adrenal gland, Cushing's disease and Addison's disease. Again, over and under secretion of cortisol is what is producing these disorders. And usually that's starts at the pituitary gland, because we know pituitary gland produces adrenocorticotropic hormone, which stimulates the adrenal cortex, ACTH, that hormone is. And if the pituitary doesn't produce enough ACTH, the adrenal gland is underactive and does not produce enough of these hormones. So symptoms of Cushing's disease, this oversecretion of cortisol, is excess fat, puffiness, facial hair, high blood glucose. And sometimes they can do surgery and remove parts of the adrenal gland. And then give artificial hormones to those people to supplant or to take the place of them removing part of the adrenal gland. Addison's disease is the opposite, caused by undersecretion of cortisol. Sometimes it's due to autoimmune damage to the adrenal glands. Leads to people being very thin, having low energy, weak, being irritable, having hyperpigmentation where they have pigments in their skin that are much darker than other parts, like in their gums it often shows up, these dark areas of their gums. And treatment would be to replace that cortisol with artificial medications that can replace the deficiency in cortisol. Okay, so you see here Tyrian dwarfism, okay, due to a lack of growth hormone. You know who he is? How you guys know? Andre the Giant?
What is that?
Andre the Giant?
Yeah. I
He-
knew the first
He's an
one.
old school wrestler.
What, didn't he hold like the world record for like weightlifting or something?
I don't believe for weightlifting. He does own the world record for number of beers drinking in one sitting.
Yeah.
He drank over 125 beers in 6 hours.
What the
Let's
hell?
see.
Probably because he's so big.
He's
so it
huge. He was like I believe 7'6" or so.
7'4".
So he had gigantism. You ever seen Obey clothing? Obey Shepard Fairey, the artist, makes that line of clothing. It comes from this little thing he produced, which was based on Andre the Giant. But then you have other symptoms of this is acromegaly. After the growth hormone is continued to be produced into adulthood, leads to swelling, this prominent brow ridge there, and prominent facial features. There you have that hyperpigmentation like we talked about with Addison's disease, and then Cushing's disease leads to these distinctive buildup of fat in the central areas of the body, not in the limbs, but in the torso, and so forth. So those are some endocrine disorders. All right, let's finish up here. So plants have hormones as well. You may not think about it. Plants have hormones that regulate growth, reproduction, dormancy in seeds, and tropisms and leaf fall. Now they don't have glands like other animals do, but they have hormones that are produced in very young cells in the root tips, and these hormones can change the growth of the plant. Okay, and that leads to what we call tropisms, the growth of a plant toward or away from a certain stimulus. Phototropism is when plants grow toward light. Geotropism, when plants grow in relation to gravity. Leaves naturally will grow up toward, away from gravity. Roots will naturally grow down toward gravity. Even if you plant a plant sideways, the leaves will grow upward, the roots will grow downward because of this tropism. And I thought this was a video. That's a sensitive plant. It's responsive to touch. If you touch that plant, all those leaves sort of curl up. So one of the main hormones in plants is auxin. Auxin stimulates cells in plants to grow, to elongate. And auxins are produced at the very growing tip, the terminal bud, it's called, of stems. Okay. And those auxins tell the cells, these auxins move downward in the plant tissue, and they stimulate the leaf, the stem to grow. And what happens is sunlight destroys the auxins. So if you imagine, look at this stem. The sunlight growing on this side destroys the auxins here. The auxins are only still present and active on the shady side, so they cause these cells to grow larger, which causes the tip of the stem to grow towards the light. This experiment was done by Charles Darwin and his son. What they did was they had some plants that they grew from a seed, exposed to light from one side, and what they found is that plants grew towards the light. If they cut off the very tip of the growing plant, that didn't happen. Because what was not being produced? Yeah, because it's only produced in the tip. Okay? They also covered the tip with a little sunproof cap. And again, there was no phototropism because again, the auxin wasn't being influenced by the light because it was being shaded. If they put a transparent cap, they found it was still affected. If they cover the base with an opaque shield, it still grew towards the light. Okay? Then if they put a little divider between the tip of the plant and the stem, if it was gelatin where auxins could still get through, it did grow towards the light. If they blocked it with something where auxins couldn't get through, it grew straight up. So what this tells us, auxins produced in the tip, it moves down the stem, and it acts according to light, causing for that phototropism. Nate?
I think it was like part of the nose.
That you missed?
No, but
No, like the tropism, like there was like a dash after.
well, it's just the growth of a plant towards a certain tip.
Oh, the term? Oh, yeah, it's growth of a plant toward a stimulus.
Hey, Mr. DeRoss, when you get home, or now, go on Twitter and search up craziest injuries. And it's,
No,
it's
that sounds like the
disgusting.
absolute worst thing I would ever want to search on.
It's disgusting.
Why?
There's this Twitter account called Craziest Injuries. Go check it out.
Why would anyone watch that?